Hello. The year is 1964. Imagine the Mt Hagen area as it was then. You'll have travelled from Port Moresby in a tiny plane that stopped at numerous airstrips between high mountains along the Wagi Valley. At the last of these, before Hagen itself, I heard my first prenasalized B, Mbants. It had been from the air that the inland population of 500,000 horticulturalists, now 8 times that number, were first seen by Australian gold prospectors in the early 1930s, an overland patrol to what had been named from afar as Mt Hagen arriving there in 1933. Pacification and missionization followed, interrupted by World War II, being resumed in the late 1940s. 25 years later, the place was peaceful. People impressed by the superior weaponry of the Australian administration and wanting to see what the new phenomena they were told about would actually bring: government, law, money. A decade further on, through disillusionment among other things, the region had acquired a bad reputation for violence. Government, law and money, and there were pigeon counterparts to these that everybody had in their mind, were already manifest in local council elections and tax raising, cash cropping, notably coffee, and trade stores. And when I say peaceful, I mean I felt safer there than in England. I didn't really slot into any received category of white person, patrol officer, missionary, medic, planter settler, but became known as someone who wrote things down in a notebook. I look back now, somewhat aghast at the impudence with which I foisted myself on people, first in a mountainous area at a place called Mbuk, and later in the grasslands at Kalawa, near to Hagen town. But I think many people took it all as part of the new era. And besides, the strangeness was quickly routinized through transactions. Buying more food than I could eat, thereby supporting an enlarged household, visiting other households in the company of helpers. At Mbuk there were no villages as such, and being known for idiosyncrasies such as pacing out the size of gardens or weighing women's net bags full of the staple for people and pigs alike of sweet potato. I don't know whether they ever knew how staggeringly beautiful I found the countryside. But what about my being a woman? This was a society in which men held the dominant public positions, conducting warfare, managing ceremonial exchange, and putting on religious events such as cult rituals, all involving relations between men and the circulation of wealth and prestige within their networks. In my PhD thesis, I coined the epithets transactors and producers. While women were only producers, men were both producers and transactors. Anyway, dependent as men were on women's work in the gardens and their pig-raising skills, men disparaged those who did not hold wealth or speak at public events, and poor men were no better than women in this respect. Yet men were not above using women to bring harm, and wives in particular, who moved between clans on marriage, might be suspected of injuring their husbands under the pressure of kinsmen with enemy connections. One source of injury was the danger they brought by being, in the anthropological parlance of the time, potentially polluting of men's health, for example, by not observing the protocols of monthly seclusion. Now I know there was a bit of questioning about whether I was really a woman or not, but the ambiguity was useful for everyone. There were times when my being a woman would swing into view and I was excluded from certain male activities, but many other times when it was conveniently overlooked. I myself axiomatically adopted appropriate forms of female modesty, such as not stepping over people's legs, while at the same time never dressing as Hagen women were dressed. My inquiries focused on women's lives and connections. I may not have followed my supervisor's research question, but guiding my interest indubitably were burning theoretical questions of Cambridge at the time, descent and alliance. The named groups, clans, between which Hagen women moved in marriage hardly required explaining. The details needn't detain us, but what I found interesting was another source of men's dependence on women. It was marriages that cemented relations between clan groups, and male affines, in-laws, especially brothers-in-law, had a vested interest in the conjugal bond. For affinal relations were the routes through which wealth flowed. Wealth? By the 1990s, this had been inflated by plane loads of shells that the Australians obtained from the coast, and by money beginning to be added. That said, pigs reared by men's wives retained their value as the principal wealth item. And the measure of men's prestige then was the amount of wealth they could get rivals to accept, the rivals then having to make an equal, if not better, return. Whether the rationale was ceremonial exchange for the sake of it, or bride wealth prestations, or war compensation, or child payments to maternal kin, in numerous contexts, men's alliances included their bestowal of women and wealth on one another. Now, something that could not have been foreseen from Cambridge was the huge amount of time people spent on court cases. I say courts, because the Indigenous dispute settling sessions one would come across in the yard outside people's houses or on ceremonial grounds or near patrol posts were regarded by the men who ran them as just like the magistrates' courts that patrol officers heard on their occasional rounds. Men awarded themselves the power to recommend compensation payments and levy fines. And what hit me in 1964-5 was that the majority of cases had women at their centre. As I said, in Women in Between, the book version of my PhD thesis, I was taken aback by 3 complaints that men perpetually worried at. The courts spent all their time hearing disputes over women, especially marital disputes and divorce cases. Women were always humbugging and leaving their husbands for no reason, and many women never settled down in marriage at all, but were constantly on the move from man to man. Now, one of the topics that sprang from a British version of interest in unilineal descent groups pivoted on whether, in this or that instance, the degree of conjugal dissolution, divorce, had an effect on the strength of descent group solidarity. I thought I'd found a thesis question. What did a high divorce rate do to clan relations in Hagen, and vice versa? And that set me off on several months of work constructing a population basis of recognised marriages, because before one can decide whether a divorce has taken place, one needs to know that a marriage has. And I wanted to be able to work out a divorce rate. Rather than sampling, I decided to do a total count of the 3 clans that composed the 860 people of the Cawilga named group at Mbuk, and the same again for 450 Elti at Kellewa. And the total number of marriages contracted for the living members of these 2 groups were respectively 330 and 173. Decisions had to be made about who was or was not included. Some of the data was from third parties, but where I could, I talked to the people concerned or to their very close kin. A lot of trudging from house to house, often to no avail, since the householders were frequently often away themselves during the day. Now, this is where memory lets me down. I think that I had with me in Hagen an article by John Barnes which provided statistical models for how one might compute diverse rates of divorce. For example, as a ratio of dissolved marriages against all marriages over a particular span, or a ratio excluding those marriages ended in death, and so forth. And I think I had a couple of comparable computations from early Highlands ethnographers, certainly augmented by the time I came to write up. I'm pretty sure I'm not transposing back from writing up to the writing I did in the field. Either way, the results were a shock. The shock was that there seemed nothing interesting at all about the Hagen material, whether from Kawalga or Elti. And here is a moment where I made a methodological mistake that actually proved extremely productive. Hagen figures might have sat in the middle range of ratios for Highlands societies. That was why it was so uninteresting, not spectacularly high or low. But one might have still characterized Highland divorce rates as overall quite high. But I made the beginner's mistake of thinking that something was only interesting if it showed up a character unique to one's field of study. I was expecting the Hagen rates to stand out as especially high. That, I surmised then, would have given me a phenomenon to explain, but they weren't. The deflation that followed was one of those moments of revelation that changed everything. All those court cases, men making speeches, an unhappy wife sitting sullenly apart, other women looking on, the fuss men made. The ostensible reason was obvious, for in the clear-cut cases, and especially if no children had yet been born, divorce meant a return of the original bride wealth that the in-laws had exchanged with one another. Prestations went both ways, and thus conjugal instability might unravel all the transactions. At least men's pride was saved if the woman was to blame, and there is a whole chapter in Women in Between called Focus for Blame. So what was all that about? And surely there was more to it. Of course, it was talk about divorce. Trumped to some extent by the colonial order to which they attached themselves, prominent men in particular found themselves creating a feverish atmosphere in which women's waywardness became the immediate and obvious source of local troubles when other things could not be talked about. Now, I didn't really have the tools of description at my disposal. This is 1964 to 5, but I had in effect fathomed an ideology. I used terms when I wrote up such as stereotype or categorization or dogma, and I was obviously aware that relations of dominance and subordination was an obsession of Highlands anthropologists at the time. They wrote of sexual differentiation and sexual antagonism, sexual here pertaining to men and women, for this was a period in the 1960s when one talked of sex roles or sexual stereotypes with a bias towards what women did or what contributed to the so-called status of women. The last chapter of Women in Between is a long disquisition of how one might weigh up what Hagen women could or could not negotiate and the advantages and disadvantages of their role as intermediaries between men, hence the book's title. Apart from ideology, another word you won't find in that book is gender. And that is because it didn't yet exist in its present sense. But it was just round the corner. 1972, when the book was published, was the year that the sociologist Anne Oakley drew on the grammatical term gender to apply to everything that was constructed about how men and women interacted with and perceived with and talked about one another. And when the term appeared, I recognized it at once. My account had already anticipated the ideological thrust of the way in which men and women referred to and apparently regarded the difference between them. If I can claim moments of professional prescience, this was one. Now, my head was down writing the thesis. You'll recall that I was working at the time, and my references hardly went beyond Melanesia and social anthropology. Also round the corner for anthropology was the women's liberation movement. Now, if you've watched film 1, you will know that I've been brought up by somebody who taught adult education classes on women in art, women in literature, and I took it for granted that women were interesting as a subject as much as anything else. It was a mild surprise to me that in 1972 a book with women in the title wasn't going to sell. Women in Between hardly merited a review in anthropological journals either. Of course, all that was to change radically and with a rush. Within a very few years, and on the heels of the Marxist turn, anthropology was to be transformed by second-wave feminism and the study of gender relations. Now, by the time I left Cambridge for Canberra in early 1969, I had accumulated a lot of pamphlets, papers, grey matter, treatises and propaganda from the emergent women's lib, and indeed discovered an Australia that was more than up to date on this. The shift in anthropology was so rapid that in 1973-4, I found myself writing the manuscript of a book, one which eventually appeared later, years later, as Before and After Gender. This was a commission for a series. That wasn't its original title. That was its retrospective title when it was finally published. This was a commission for a series which never got off the ground, one meant to showcase, in today's parlance, what anthropologists had to say about relations between men and women. I drew on Oakley's sex-gender distinction, articulated attributes now labelled male and female, and above all developed the notion that such relations, gender relations as I then examined them, stood for, were about, a host of other things. Unless one understood that, one didn't understand the tenacity of the gender distinctions. My materials consisted both of the anthropological accounts I was asked to introduce and of all those feminist debates at the time. In respect of the latter, I thus proceeded to draw out of the material the way in which similarities and differences between the sexes could be imagined as an implicit set of constructs to do with the antinomy between, say, individual and society and its implications for freedom and power. However, no one knew about the manuscript. That had one positive outcome. Annette Wiener published her famous reworking of Malinowski's Trobriand Island material in 1976. In it, she laments how ethnographers have overlooked women's sources of power and spends some pages on women in between as an example of this neglect. I had been blinded to the complexity of male-female interactions, she asserts, and had fallen into a traditional male trap. I was so shattered that it took me years, not months, to recover. In retrospect, however, I owed Wiener a service because it set me on a new critical path. I had to position myself within the growing arena of feminist anthropology as such. I could no longer take my interest in gender relations for granted. In any event, although that unpublished manuscript lay dormant for years, it had been informed by my work in Hagen, and the exercise then prepared me a bit for writing The Gender of the Gift later. And I shall come back to this work, but remark again that in a way The Gender of the Gift undoes Women in Between. Women in Between was concerned to give a contemporary account of life in modern Hagen and was written in a sociological tenor. I used that epithet, sociological, not to refer to anthropology's sister discipline, but to summon the extent to which I focused on social life, the relations and activities through which people engaged with one another, the resources at their disposal, the circumstances and constraints under which they exercised agency, the locus of power, collective organisation, and so forth. The book addressed kinship, politics, and economics, but with a notable absence of matters to do with religion or ritual, partly because this had been a focus of Wiesedom's and later Strauss's inquiries, partly because, for various reasons, I was excluded from men's affairs in this regard. In this narrational context, I took the division of labour, a foundational concept of the era, between men and women as a given, and my illumination with respect to gender ideology assumed that the division of labour fed into ongoing equivocations in the relations between them. It was only after a decade or so of pursuing the notion that such gender relations could stand for or were about other things that I realised the inadequacy of focusing solely on men and women as these categories presented themselves. Concomitantly, I would subsequently recognise that notion as an instance of analogical reasoning more generally. If Hagen men's concerns over marital dissolution was a stand-in for other concerns, perhaps these were extended to their new relations with colonial realities. Women's threat to men's prowess, which had always dogged enmity between men, had now become a particular way of talking about the colonial shadow. But that little bit of early work I did with the women's lip materials, alongside what later I would call Euro-American thought, with all its talks of rights and sexual mythologies, as well as the maturation of feminist anthropology drawn in part from the same intellectual sources, was a kind of counterpart to the Melanesian dilemmas. Imagining Euro-American gender relations had itself become a challenge. Subject and object, nature and culture, individual and society, biology and constructionism, these all seemed packed into what scholars and activists were writing with respect to gender. Ultimately, however, it was working through how one might theorize, analyze, and describe maleness and femaleness in the light of Melanesian thought that led me, in the company of numerous others, of course, companions, scholars, and ethnographic interlocutors, to conceptualize gender relations rather differently. Here I recall that one impetus was a complaint from the Canadian anthropologist Eric Schwimmer. Not so long, it seemed to me, after my monograph, he complained that whenever I wrote, it was always about Mt Hagen. When was I going to start on the work of synthesis? Well, the gender of the gift is nothing but a synthesis. Its materials drawn from different places and times across Melanesia in order to offer generalizations. Not so much the kinds of variable dependent generalizations that systematic cross-cultural comparison might yield, and that in fact I undertook for a limited extent in Women in Between. Rather, I was searching for insights into the conditions of possibility for what was manifest in people's thoughts about and dealings with one another through their conceptualizations of gender relations. Readers sometimes treat the gender of the gift as though I were rehearsing an ethnography, but that could not be further from the case. It draws on ethnographic material and the detailed work of many Melanesian ethnographers as it does on feminist thinking, but at numerous terms queries the language of exposition in order to arrive at account applicable with greater or lesser force across the region. Indeed, as a point of method, I found myself querying the discreteness of Melanesia's many societies, as they were called, this discreteness being a condition for undertaking cross-societal, that is, cross-cultural comparison of a quantitative kind. These diverse configurations imitated, repeated, omitted, underlined, weakened, ignored this or that constellation of attributes, but did not present units of information susceptible to quantification. In fact, the question of analogy that was to play such a role in my thinking about gender applied also to the comparative exercise, and we'll come back to that. Let me return now to fieldwork, as we unabashedly referred to it in the 1960s. I want to put on record my profound gratitude to everyone who helped me. People gave me their time, shared their food, assisted my wobbling efforts over narrow bridges, put up with questions, allowed me to walk across their gardens or count the number of pigs or chickens they kept, instructed me in the etiquette of eating sugarcane, confided in me, guarded me in the first few days in a new place, accompanied my visits to other houses, translated tapes. As one faithful friend whispered, all the work was good, but tape work was awful. I hope people eventually felt repaid with such gifts as I could muster, including gifts of the money that had become ubiquitous. Reciprocity was all important. Imagine me standing in a new place where people had built me a small house next to a ceremonial ground. I'm waiting for someone to arrive back from a visit, someone who had been put forward by the local committee man, the second in command to the local government councillor. I knew him by his single name, Oki. This man, I was told, would be the very best person to work for me and accompany me when I wanted to find particular people. I'm a bit desperate and anxious that it will all work out. He arrives, youngish but not so young, himself married, seemingly agreeable, content with the rate of payment. After a little while, we decide to walk over to an area some distance away. The paths are narrow, forcing us into single file, skirting the muddy puddles that enlarge the path because everyone skirts them. A bit of chit-chat and I'm in front. A voice floats up from behind. We're speaking Melanesian, the pidgin lingua franca, and the brief conversation translates as follows. Well, if I'm to work for you, I wonder, would you be able to take me to Port Moresby? I freeze, silence. I'm thinking, mean as it now sounds, that's a major outlay. It would blow a huge hole in what I had available as a student, not just for him, but for everyone else. And if we started off at that level, what would the next request be? Doubly anxious now, I make the only reply I can and hold my breath. No, I'm terribly sorry, I can't afford it. Back comes the cheerful response. All right, never mind, give me a cigarette. He was, of course, trying out my astuteness, assessing the scale of my resources, discovering if I would part with things in a promise to someone with whom I didn't yet have a relationship, while at the same time establishing the fact that reciprocity in relationships didn't stop with mere payment for work, and I hope he felt he got something worthwhile in the end.